Hello and welcome to part one of our parliamentary review of the year, in which we look at the big stories of 1999, the controversies, the dramas and the people behind them. In the next half hour, a year of almost unprecedented change. Hereditary peers are told thank you but goodbye as the government brings down the curtain on hundreds of years of tradition. Martin McGuinness, a former IRA commander, leaves his past behind him to become Education Minister in Northern Ireland as Westminster ends nearly 30 years of direct rule from London. And Michael Portillo, love him or loathe him, he's back in the House of Commons following his defeat at the general election 2.5 years ago. But first, the great noblemen of England have governed father and son since before the last millennium. Labour were elected on a manifesto pledge to end their reign and to remove the rights of hereditary peers to sit and vote in the House of Lords. Fulfilling that commitment wasn't easy.
The time is 8:10. It's quite hard to imagine this country without the old House of Lords at the very least.
It was left to Baroness Jay, the daughter of the former Labour Prime Minister Jim Callaghan, to unroll the government's plans for the abolition of hereditary peers.
The White Paper confirms that all hereditary peers will cease to have automatic rights of membership of the House. It also confirms that hereditary peers will be given the right to vote in parliamentary elections and to stand as candidates for election to the House of Commons without having to disclaim their peerages.
Conservatives, though many were against reform, were united in their desire to know what the government's long-term plans were. They argued that abolition of hereditary rights did not constitute constructive reform and did not make the House of Lords any more democratic.
Time and again it has fallen to this House to press for precise answers on behalf of the people of this country. So is this ancient House not entitled to be treated with the same courtesy that we have asked for others? Are we not entitled, my lords, to know where in the long run we are headed? My lords, the most depressing aspect of the announcements today is that we have seen no clear vision of the future of this House of Parliament, and to say that it is modernisation is simply not enough.
The future of 92 hereditary peers was saved by the former Speaker, now Lord Wetherell, who put down an amendment which ensured that 92 hard-working, respected hereditary peers could remain. The move changed the whole nature of the Lords' debate.
The House knows that the amendment which I moved with the Noble Earl, the Earl of Carnarvon and Noble Lord Marsh on the 11th of May was overwhelmingly supported by this House. It was, of course, a compromise, and as the House well knows, it was designed to overcome the fact that this House could not act effectively or efficiently if all the hereditary peers were to disappear at once.
Reform of the House of Lords produced some unlikely heroes. The eccentric Earl of Onslow almost became a household name.
I am here by accident of birth because my forebears got either drunk with Walpole or Pitt. Probably both. I'm here because I'm summoned to do my duty. If and when Parliament says I should not be here, then I go, and I am not a corner shop in Scunthorpe.
Third reading of the House of Lords Bill, the Baroness Jay of Paddington.
The Earl of Burford brought hooliganism right into the chamber, jumping on the woolsack, itself a symbol of British economic might, to proclaim his own rather peculiar political philosophy.
Been told by his bosses in Europe to bring the British Constitution into line with other European countries in preparation for political union.
Thomas, Galloway, Dunlop, Juroy, Dublicki, Lord Strathclyde.
Their lordships slowly, painfully accepted their fate. At the last, on the day of their abolition, on what could have been a day full of history and emotion, confusion reigned.
May I, your lordships, say one particular point? Yes. My lords.
There is some discussion going on to which I'm not privy. When one of your lordships is on his feet, it is not for the occupant of the woolsack, my lords, to intervene.
My lords, I'm advised that the noble lord, the Lord Chairman of Committees on the woolsack, should put the motion.
Lords, I'm very grateful for that very proper intervention from Her Majesty's government's front bench.
was a noble lord who was trying to make an observation, and I think it would be appropriate if he were to be allowed to make the observation as opposed to being shut up by the front bench.
My lords, I won't need the microphones because
My lords, I hesitate to intervene again, but I do think there is some confusion.
But if we're going to move into a new era and a new chamber, a new house, we might at least have some independence of thought and mind where the government does not railroad things through, just like you guillotined me last time, so I don't dare let you get up. There are many other things like that that should be said perhaps in our last moments when the only independent voice disappears. And with that, I will sit down.
After the opening of the new session of Parliament, the 92 hereditaries who were left and were elected by their colleagues to stay made the most of their new minority status in a largely appointed House of Lords.
We've been reformed. I'm elected. Oh, I love it. I absolutely love it.
The biggest political development in the year was undoubtedly the end of nearly 30 years of direct rule in Northern Ireland. The long-awaited breakthrough in the peace programme came as the millennium drew to a close, but it always seemed like touch and go right up to the end. A peace deal for Northern Ireland seemed always to be a case of so near and yet so far, deadlines being set, deadlines coming and going, and for much of the time one woman trying to bring all sides together.
Yes, it's difficult. I don't enjoy talking to people with the kind of background of some I do, but I prefer to talk than have people killed. And that's what the Good Friday Agreement of base is about.
In early summer, the Prime Minister came to the House exhausted after days and nights of negotiating in Belfast on a new deal aimed at breaking the deadlock.
So I say to people, discuss the detail, debate it, engage, but do not throw away the best chance for peace we will have in this generation.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
But decommissioning, as ever, was the main stumbling block.
He's asking us to sacrifice the democratic principle to expediency. And he's asking us to take a gamble with an ineffective and unfair safety net.
The fear in Ulster is very straightforward. It is that Sinn Féin will enter the executive, the IRA will not then disarm, Sinn Féin will assert they are separate from the IRA, and there will then be pressure for them to remain on the executive for fear that their removal would be the trigger for a fresh bout of violence.
In the event, a meeting of the Northern Ireland Assembly collapsed in chaos, with Ulster Unionists staging a boycott. The peace process was parked.
as we conclude this little farce today, still look for sensible, positive unionism to grasp the opportunity which is theirs.
But a review under former Senator George Mitchell finally helped to persuade the Ulster Unionists to say yes. Northern Ireland's first cabinet in a quarter of a century was nominated at an historic meeting at Stormont.
I nominate Martin McGuinness as Minister for Education.
This was followed by the approval of the order formally devolving power to the Northern Ireland Assembly, with Peter Mandelson, back in government less than a year after his resignation over his home loan, making the historic announcement.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is indeed a momentous occasion as Northern Ireland begins to put behind it the conflict, prejudice and division that has blighted the lives of everyone in both communities for a generation. For the first time, all shades of political opinion in Northern Ireland will have a stake in the future. After a quarter of a century, the curtain is finally coming down on direct rule. Of course, there will still be anger about the past, and real difficulties undoubtedly still lie ahead. But this generation is now turning the page to the future.
Peter Mandelson was just one of a number of big names to make the headlines at Westminster. Labour, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats all had change on their minds.
At this post, 20 yards from the border, 23-year-old Marine Lieutenant Ashdown from Somerset has local forces as well as Marines under his command.
I'm looking forward now to having the time in due course, when I hand down the leadership of the party in June this year, to spending a little more time with my friends and to be able to have a little more space for my family.
After 11 years in the job, Paddy Ashdown began the new year by announcing his retirement as leader of the Liberal Democrats. Perhaps he'd got a bit fed up with all the barracking that greeted him every time he got to his feet in the House of Commons.
Mr. Paddy Ashdown.
And a Happy New Year to you too.
Mr. Ashdown.
They're going to miss me when I'm gone, Madam Speaker.
Mr. Ashdown's last Prime Minister's question time as party leader earned him warm praise. He'd just flown back from a visit to Kosovo.
Yes, I shall miss you too.
Since it is the last question time of the Right Honourable Gentleman, can I at least pay tribute to the tremendous contribution he's made to British politics over the past few years, and not least on this issue of Kosovo and Bosnia, where he was well ahead of the rest of us and right long before the rest of us.
On Ian Hislop's team and MP...
Charles Kennedy, the son of a crofter with a fondness for appearing on TV chat shows, took over as Liberal Democrat leader, pledging to make social justice his party's rallying cry. The former Deputy Conservative Party chairman, Lord Archer, resigned as Tory candidate for Mayor of London and was thrown off the Tory benches in the Lords after it was revealed he'd asked a friend to fake an alibi in a libel case in 1987.
Support Charter 88.
Yeah, I thought you'd like that. I'd enjoy it.
The former Conservative Defence Minister, Alan Clark, died of a brain tumour aged 71. He was succeeded as Tory MP for Kensington and Chelsea by the former Cabinet Minister Michael Portillo, who returned from the political wilderness after losing his old seat at the general election.
I swear by Almighty God that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, her heirs and successors, according to law, so help me God.
And maybe the biggest story of them all, the shock announcement that Cherie Blair, aged 45, is expecting her fourth child, the first baby to be born to a serving Prime Minister for 150 years.
May I, on behalf of the Liberal Democrats, congratulate the Prime Minister and his wife on expecting their fourth child.
I thank him for his congratulations. I certainly didn't intend to start a trend, however.
For once, Madam Speaker, may I begin by congratulating the Prime Minister and his wife on their happy family news. In future, when he hears the sound of crying in the next room, it won't be the Chancellor wishing he had his job.
Will William and Fionn Hague be able to resist trying for a little shadow baby of their own? The Leader of the Opposition's official comment was, all in good time. Well, joining me now to discuss the changing times at Westminster are the former Conservative Home Secretary Michael Howard, now a backbencher for the first time in many years, Simon Hughes for the Liberal Democrats, pipped at the post in his party's leadership election, and the Labour MP Tony Benn, who's standing down at the next election. We ought to start really by talking about Northern Ireland and the extraordinary changes that we've seen there. Tony Benn, do you think we were going to be where we are now even just a few weeks ago?
Oh, I think the settlement, if it holds, which I believe it will, is the most significant achievement for the government. During the election, it was indicated that if a ceasefire resumed, it would immediately be followed by talks. And I think President Clinton claims some credit because it was the first thing he mentioned when the government was elected. I think that Mo Mowlam did a marvellous job. The Prime Minister steered it through, and Senator Mitchell. I met Joe Adams first when Ken Livingstone was chairman of the Greater London Council, and I've known him ever since, and I was persuaded from the first time that a peaceful settlement was what he wanted, a political settlement. And if it holds, it'll be a tremendous achievement, biggest single issue in United Kingdom politics.
Michael Howard, given what Tony Benn's just said, how do you see your own party's scepticism about some of the changes there have been over the last few years?
No, I mean, I agree with Tony. If it holds, it will be a tremendous achievement. I was sorry he didn't mention John Major's part in it, which was very considerable in starting off the whole process. I think this is, if it does hold, a real bipartisan achievement. And although my party's been critical of some aspects of what's happened, under the present government. For example, the release of prisoners before the guns and the bombs had been given up. I agree with what Tony has said. If it holds, it will be a great achievement for which all those who took part, beginning with John Major, who started the whole process off, but clearly many members of the present government deserve a great deal of praise as well.
How do you feel about Martin McGuinness's new job as a minister?
Well, again, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. I do have concerns about it. I do have concerns that you have an education minister there who is closely associated with an organisation that still has access to guns and bombs. So the key to it all is to give them up. And if they're given up soon, then the enormous risks which people have taken, and David Trimble most of all, deserves huge credit if it does come off for the risks he has taken, then theirs will be a tremendous achievement. But we're not there yet.
Simon Hughes.
Well, colleagues are right. It's been an agenda item at the centre of British politics in Parliament pretty well since the Great Reform Act. I mean, all the time. It's never gone away from any single government and any single Parliament. And if we achieve in the last months, last days of this century, something which settles a new relationship, and it's entirely different from devolution to Scotland and Wales, because it's a devolution and at the same time a changed relationship with Ireland. And I think that starts another process, a democratic process. It's a sort of disestablishment politically of Northern Ireland from a settlement that was never likely to last. I mean, the settlement in the second decade of the century was always at risk because it was such a precarious political arrangement. And if both sides can sign up to something where they work together, and all credit, Michael makes the valid point, they have to be tested. But the best test will be whether people who come from the different traditions can work together on the agenda that is of everybody, and education is a very good example of that.
I don't want to destroy the unity around our table here, but we do need to talk about the House of Lords. Tony Benn, you must be delighted by what's happened in terms of reform this year. No more hereditary peers in the House of Lords?
Well, but there are 91 elected hereditary peers. Now, we were elected on a manifesto saying we would remove hereditary peers, and in fact a compromise was engineered by Jack Weatherall, the former Speaker, under which 91 remained, and now we have a mass of life peers, and there are due to be a lot more, which fills the House with people who are not elected either. I mean, in a funny way, it goes right back to the beginning, because when Edward I started peerages in the 13th century, they weren't hereditary. Hereditary peers only came in about 1387. So it is a modernisation back to the Middle Ages. And I'm in favour of an elected House, I always have been. So this is a move away from historical patronage to contemporary patronage.
But do you see Tony Blair giving the Lords an elected chamber of their own?
No, because you see, remember this, the man in British politics, or the woman in British politics, who wants the House of Lords more than anyone else is the Prime Minister of the day, because it gives him or her patronage. I mean, in 1979, when the Labour Party was in favour of the abolition of the House of Lords, Jim Callaghan announced at the manifesto meeting that if that was in the manifesto, he would resign the leadership of the Labour Party before the election. I mean, that indicated how strongly Prime Ministers feel, and the power to reward friends, to create vacancies in the House of Commons, and so on. It's so great.
Michael Howard, but you've got to now presumably jump on the bandwagon of having an elected second chamber.
Oh, I don't think it's a question of jumping on the bandwagon. You may remember that William Hague asked Lord Mackay, James Mackay, to set up a commission, head a commission, to look into ways in which we could have a new House of Lords, and one of the things which he recommended was an elected House. He came up with 2 recommendations. That was one of them. I agree with Tony. I think the present situation is quite appalling. It is the most tremendous increase in the Prime Minister's powers of patronage, and he's going to use that patronage to make sure that the House of Lords is another one of his poodles.
Lords, cronies or senators, Simon Hughes?
Well, they're going to be cronies. Like other colleagues, they should be elected. But there's a jigsaw, there's a constitutional jigsaw, because we have no written constitution. Logically, you look at all these things together. You should work out what you want the Commons to do, whether you want a second chamber, how it should be elected, because the method of election for the second chamber has to bear a relationship to the method of election for the first chamber, how you divide the powers, to whom the executive is accountable. And the trouble with our present constitutional modernisation is that it's as typically British, as it always has been. It has depended on a few bits of a programme, but not put together in a coherent way. So I regret that we will end up with a lot of nominated people. Our view is it could reflect the new United Kingdom with the regions of England and the countries of the UK being represented there by election. That would be the best solution.
You don't want them to be called lords anymore, do you? You want them to be called senators, or
yes,
what would they be?
Well, senator. I mean, lords is also a medieval title.
Lord of Parliament.
No, well, that's apparently the leaked suggestion for the Wakeham Commission, which sounds even more silly, if I may say so respectfully to Lord Wakeham, than other proposals. I mean, a senator's. We need a modern word for a second chamber. There's no theology about it, but senators seem to be as good a word as any, and it has a distinction between the old system, which was hereditary and nominated, bishops and law lords, to something that I hope we get a radical solution to. But I'm fearful we will get a conservative solution which doesn't allow real democratic participation.
I mean, I don't think the word conservative is appropriate there. You mustn't use the word conservative as an adjective.
I'm sure
for
you meant
everything you don't
conservatives
like.
with a small c. Tony Benn, do you think that if you embark on this enormous great journey of reform, with this small change to the makeup of the House of Lords, you actually destroy the relationship between the Commons and the Lords and the monarchy? I mean, what's going to happen?
The monarchy has nothing to do with it, really. I mean, the House of Lords has propped up the monarchy, and if you criticise the Lords, they always said you were threatening the monarchy, because the Crown has powers, but the Queen doesn't. No, I think the real question is why are they so frightened of an elected second chamber? People say you couldn't have a conflict with the Commons, but the powers of the Lords are not too bad. You can delay for a bit. I think there were 870 amendments in the Lords to the Greater London Bill. Now, they were a product, often happened to me when I was a minister. I'd introduce a bill. In the Commons, somebody would raise a difficulty. I'd say, I'll put it right in another place. And most of the amendments made in the Lords are made at the instigation of ministers. And you need that. But it took us, 700 years to get a democratic House of Commons. And I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't take as long to have a democratic House of Lords, or whatever you call it. I mean, a second chamber, you call them councillors, call them anything. I don't call them senators. But they mustn't be by patronage, and they mustn't be by inheritance.
One of the fears, surely, has got to be that with more professional politicians in the House of Lords, it's going to be less representative than the more representative.
Well, that's a possible danger. I mean, I think this all goes to show that it was extremely misconceived, extremely stupid, to embark upon the abolition of the old House of Lords before deciding what you wanted to put in its place. There was absolutely no justification for that whatever. And the Prime Minister set up a Royal Commission. He could have set up the Royal Commission a year earlier, and then everybody could have known what the Royal Commission recommended, and then they would have had an alternative to compare with the old House, and then they could have made a much more informed decision than the decision which had to be made a few weeks ago.
Can I add a word? I share Michael's view about that, and I think that the other foolishness is that we made a decision about Scottish devolution, my party had long supported, without working out its implications for English members of Parliament. Yes. We have a ridiculous situation now arrived in part and due to arrive further with the rest of the devolution, whereby you do get everybody in Parliament voting on English business, but English MPs not voting on the other. There ought to have been a package, and it would have been far better to have a constitutional commission on the Lords and the Commons and devolution together to try to have some coherence and some considered result. And I'm afraid it will be fixed a bit. We may even end up with too many politicians still in Westminster.
It is outrageous that every transport minister there has been in this government has been a Scot. Now, I have...
Sorry,
it's outrageous because...
Not so outrageous that many of us have stayed awake at night thinking about it.
It's outrageous because they decide transport issues in my constituency, and Tony's, and Simon's, but actually they don't even decide transport decisions in their own constituencies.
Yes,
the present transport minister isn't even elected at all.
No, but
the previous ones were elected.
That is not a valid argument.
Of course
I
it
think
is.
Keir Hardy was a Scottish miner, was elected for East London, and then for...
But there was no devolution.
Well, I know, but there wasn't. I mean, I am in favour of a federal thing. I introduced a bill called the Commonwealth of Britain Bill some time ago, which provided for total devolution to England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland would slip off as it will, and with a federal parliament, small federal parliament. I think that's okay. What I'm afraid of is Lord Wakeham will come along and introduce a new idea of representative, by which he means a cross-section of opinion.
Let's move on for just quickly, because we haven't got very much time. It's going to be we don't want to talk about change. It's going to be it's been a time of change for all of you. Michael Howard, you're learning how to be a new backbencher after goodness knows how many years on the front bench. Simon, I don't want to rub it in, but you were pipped at the post, as we said in our introduction, for the leadership of your party. And Tony Benn, you're leaving the House of Commons at the next general election. Michael Howard, what's the Commons going to be like without Tony Benn?
A poorer place. A much poorer place. I think everybody on all sides listens pretty intently when Tony gets up, whether they agree with what he says or not. It's a distinctive view. It's a view born of very great experience, and the Commons will undoubtedly be a much poorer place without him.
Tony Benn, you've championed democracy for, well, whatever I've read, as long as I can remember, all your political life, and yet you're consistently rejected by the masses, democratically.
I've been elected by one more parliamentary elections than anyone else. I've won 2 more than Ted Heath, because I've had 4 by-elections tucked away.
You may have this common appeal, but it has to be said that you haven't won any elections to the leadership of your party, have you?
That was about a debate. No, I think the thing, I've just started my 50th year in Parliament. I took my seat on the 4th of December 1950, so I'm just beginning my 50th year. And the conclusion I've come to, really, is that I'll have more time and more freedom for the things I believe in outside the House of Commons than inside.
But you won't have any more power, will you? Because the power of Tony Benn is as an MP,
Well, I'm not so sure about that. I'm not so sure about that. If you look at how change occurs, it always begins outside Parliament and finally penetrates. When I was a young member, the whips used to say, "Do you mind staying up all night? We're going to abolish the means test." And I said, "Great." Now they tell you to stay up all night to reintroduce it for disabled people. I can't do it. I won't do it. So I'll have more freedom and more time. And I think if you look at take Seattle, for example. That was an indication.
Let's not get into Seattle.
No, but I mean, if you wait and see, every government in the world is going to notice what happens.
Where do you go, Simon Hughes?
Well, just 2 reflections. One is, I think Parliament is losing power, and that's an issue that should concern all of us. And Tony's rightfully fought the battle to make sure the executive are accountable, and we're in danger of losing that more and more.
So where do you go, though?
Well, but the second issue is that we all must fight for the independence of people to speak their mind, and I've always argued that on key issues, whips should require your loyalty, but there are far too many occasions when whips are requiring everybody who comes, and the loss of people like Tony and Michael, when he has senior people been in government, means you lose people who are free of the shackles of having to be subservient to the whips.
Are you standing down Michael Howard at the next election?
No.
When he goes, I said, when he goes.
Hasten to add, I've been reselected by my association, and I'm not standing
Why did you
there.
scuttle away from William Hague's front bench?
Well, I don't accept that description of it at all.
You don't get on with him, though, do you?
Yes, of course I do.
Do you?
No, and I've remained completely loyal to him, and I think he's doing an extremely good job in really very difficult circumstances. But a job that
you wouldn't like to do?
I think he's doing it better than anyone else could do in the present circumstances. I absolutely agree with that. I've done it for 2 years, and I think that I thought, and I've been proved right, that I would enjoy life much more on the backbenches in opposition than I did in the shadow cabinet. And I think that's particularly true when you've been in government. I was in government for 12 years and had the responsibility of taking decisions. And after you've done it for that long, being in the shadow cabinet, I think, is quite difficult.
That's what keeps us going, Max. Some of us are still aspiring to be in government.
That's all we've got time for. It just remains time for me to thank my guests, Tony Benn, Michael Howard and Simon Hughes. In our next programme, we'll be looking at how Westminster reacted to devolution in Wales and Scotland, and all things European. The launch of the Britain in Europe campaign, a Eurosceptic's nightmare, as Messrs Heseltine and Clark join up with Tony Blair. The European parliamentary elections that dealt a body blow to proportional representation and produced a rare Conservative victory over Labour. And the Welsh Assembly, what's left for MPs at Westminster to talk about. From all of us here at Westminster, goodbye for now.